Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, November 16th, 2016. I've got a couple of proposals that have some interest and some traction, but they are dead on arrival politically in Washington. First up, my outgoing California Senator, Barbara Boxer, who has served, is it 3 terms or 4 terms? She's been there since 1992. She is stepping down, retiring, and the voters of California selected Kamala Harris, our Attorney General, to succeed Barbara Boxer. And I've had this on and off affair of sorts, totally platonic, with Barbara Boxer over the years. She is a tenacious individual, and she was offended back in the early 1990s when she was a guest on my radio show, and she didn't like a question that I asked her about Tony Coelho. He was a California congressman who'd been caught up in the savings and the House Post Office scandal, and was also implicated in some fundraising improprieties. And Barbara took great umbrage that I asked her the question. She felt she didn't have enough time to answer before the show was over, and she boycotted me for a couple of years. Then we reconnected because we were both opposed to the original Gulf War, the Kuwait War, back in 1990 and 91. And then we connected over various issues because she was a strong opponent of the George W. Bush administration. And Barbara Boxer has zero chance of seeing a bill that she has introduced passed. It is to abolish the Electoral College. Now, I support ending the use of the Electoral College, but it will require a constitutional amendment. And for that very reason, it has no hope of passage. It is a hopeless quest. And I'd love to see a way around it, but because the Electoral College gives inordinate power to the small states, those small states will never permit the Constitution to be amended to reduce their power. And so it's a feel-good piece of legislation. Now, there is a smart workaround for the Electoral College, and that is to get laws passed at the state level that instruct the electors for, say, the state of Ohio or the state of California to vote the sentiment of the people expressed by the popular vote. And if that were honored across the board, then the Electoral College would simply be a rubber stamp for the popular vote. That is one way to achieve Barbara Boxer's goal. But the idea that the small states would permit the amendments to the Constitution that would reduce their influence and power, well, I simply think that is dead on arrival. Likewise, Donald Trump has said that he wants term limits for members of Congress, the House and the Senate. And his Republican counterparts, including Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, are not too intrigued by that. McConnell said, well, we already have term limits. It's called elections. And I have to say I wrestle with the idea of term limits because back in the 90s, I used to say that I wanted term limits for people like Jesse Helms and other, of these far-right Republicans. But I didn't want to see term limits for the politicians who I support and vote for. And we come up with the same issue. If you attempt to amend the Constitution to impose term limits, you're asking the members of the House and Senate to impose limits on themselves, and based on the population of the Senate and the House today, I consider that to be another impossible quest. And I, again, have mixed feelings because I believe I should be able to elect my member of Congress over and over again if I think that person is doing the job well. The Constitution only gives 2-year terms to members of Congress for that very reason. And I believe that term limits are a way of me trying to get rid of your member of Congress or the Senate, not so much my own. So Again, Trump is wasting time and political capital to promote an idea like this, but it's a free country, and Barbara Boxer can grandstand all she wants as she heads for a retirement by promoting her bill to abolish the Electoral College. Somebody on Facebook shared this with me today. It's a quote from H.L. Mencken, and it goes back almost 100 years. This is July of 1920, 96 years ago. Quote, "As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron." Now, some people think that prediction has already been achieved, but I think that Trump clearly deserves the H.L. Mencken Award. Now, what's fascinating is that Donald Trump is tweeting madly. He's not talking to the press. He tried to sneak out to dinner last night without having any reporters shadow him. And he is busy trying to spin up that his transition is just going super, super well. In fact, he tweeted this morning before I was up that it's going so smoothly. And he is swiping at the New York Times, which dutifully reports the attacks from Trump on the gray lady. And it's kind of an interesting neener conversation, because the Times had criticized Trump for the way he has been handling the congratulatory phone calls that come in from foreign leaders. Many of them have to look up the number for the Trump organization on the Internet and call a switchboard there. He's not using the standard protocol of a State Department person who's there to brief him on, each person who he's talking with. And so he's kind of quibbling. He said, well, he's made and received calls from many foreign leaders, despite what the New York Times said: Russia, Britain, China, Saudi Arabia, Japan. Now, the Times responds that it reported that Trump had taken calls from the leaders of Egypt, Israel, Russia, and Britain, but said they had been conducted haphazardly and without the State Department briefings that I mentioned. So we also are hearing that it is completely inaccurate that Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who I'm going to tell you more about in a second, has been purging the transition team of people allied with Governor Chris Christie. We're told that couldn't be further from the truth. And so I think that we're going to have this truth emergency continue in a crisis mode for the next 4 years, because even on trivial matters, Trump is so sensitive and so concerned about being right all the time that he's going to be maintaining this kind of chatter at all times on, like I say, trivial matters that only are significant to an insecure narcissist. So the facts are that the Trump team has not delivered all of the documents they need to begin the transition, where, for example, the Department of Commerce has a point person that they are dealing with. And it turns out that most of these departments, including the State Department, the Pentagon, and the Justice Department, haven't heard a peep from anyone on the Trump transition team. And that's 8 days after he claimed victory. So I think there is disarray, and I think that this is just another window into how Trump tries to manage reality. So Jared Kushner, who is he? Well, he's profiled by The Guardian today, and he is the powerful son-in-law married to Ivanka Trump. And he came out of a grueling experience where his father, a real estate billionaire, was prosecuted and convicted by former DA, or U.S. Attorney, Chris Christie, before Christie got elected as the governor of New Jersey. So we are told that the infighting of the in the transition team was fueled by Kushner's arrival at the transition team last week, we think on Thursday, because on Friday, Chris Christie was sent packing. Now, I have a hard time believing that this ancient feud between Christie and the Kushners only surfaced and caused the ejection of the fat boy from New Jersey last week. Christie has been kissing Trump's ass ever since he got out of the presidential primary. And Jared Kushner, who controls the New York Observer, which was a reliable source for dirt on Hillary during the presidential campaign, there is power and influence there. And Jared Kushner is the one who we believe has been proposed by Trump for a high-level security clearance. Now, we're told that the request for clearances for all the Trump kids was made by a low-level underling, and that has been repudiated. But Kushner would be in conflict with a federal law that was passed after Bobby Kennedy was appointed Attorney General by his brother, the president, and that was an act of nepotism I was always uncomfortable with. So in 1967, Congress passed an anti-nepotism law that would presumably prevent the president from appointing Jared Kushner to any paid position in the administration. But there isn't anything that really prevents Kushner from hanging out at the White House, wielding influence as an unpaid advisor. And so it remains to be seen exactly what role he will play, but he appears to be not only the eyes and ears of Donald Trump, but also his enforcer. And so he is one to watch as this administration takes shape. And I'm going to resist speculating on the idea of whether Rudy Giuliani will be the Secretary of State. We're told no new announcements are expected today of staffing of the new administration. And I'm going to try to just comment when people are actually appointed rather than try to play a guessing game around rumors. So the Republican Party, which was scheduled to implode when Donald Trump lost the election on November 8th, has managed to rally and present at least the outward appearance of unity. And in the House of Representatives, where Paul Ryan's shaky hold on the speakership was under attack from those who think that he is a sellout to the Republican establishment, well, all that is tamped down now, and Ryan has a new lease on life as Speaker, and he will continue to lead the Republicans in the House. And meanwhile, the Democrats, who have pretended not to be a fractured party, but in fact, I think it's a brand that has limited appeal, and the party is in need of a real reorganization. So because Harry Reid has retired as the Democratic leader in the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate elected Chuck Schumer of New York as their minority leader. That's not a surprise, but it's hard to swallow. Chuck Schumer is an opportunist. He's a very abrasive media hound kind of a guy, and he's also pretty ruthless. Now, maybe that will serve the Democrats well as they operate in the minority. And Schumer made some smart moves. He has expanded his leadership team to include Bernie Sanders of Vermont, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and to try to appeal to the Trump wing of the party, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. He's up for re-election in 2018. So Schumer says this team is ideologically and geographically diverse. It mixes the wisdom of experience with the vigor of youth, at least in Senate years. And so, he's at least paying attention to the progressive wing of the party. He has named Bernie Sanders as the outreach chairman, and Sanders will remain the ranking Democrat on the Senate Budget Committee, where I think he'll be fighting for the little people. So these are not bad moves. Democrats reelected Dick Durbin of Illinois as minority whip, and Senator Patty Murray of Washington in the number 3 leadership position. I would prefer Durbin over Schumer as the Democratic leader, but as usual, nobody asked me. Now to the House situation. Nancy Pelosi is not seen as terribly vulnerable as the leader of the Democrats, but a congressman from Ohio, Tim Ryan, no relation to Paul Ryan, but he's a moderate Democrat. He is considering running against Nancy Pelosi in the leadership race. And Pelosi has put off that determination, that vote, until after Thanksgiving. So that gives him some time to generate a campaign. But she has raised so much money for the House Democrats, I think $127 million in this cycle alone, that many of them owe their campaigns and their seats to her, and it is unlikely that they're going to dump her. I think it's time for a change. And as you may know, I've known Nancy Pelosi since she went to Congress. I worked on one of her campaigns back in the 90s. I like her as a person. I have parted ways with her politically, starting with when she refused to allow even an investigation of impeachment charges against George W. Bush for taking us into war on lies. And I have found that, because of all the money she raises, she's much more comfortable with corporate executives than real people these days. And I think it's time, because of her age and the failure of the Democrats to win elections and be relevant, I think it's a good time for her to step down. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work with your subscriptions to the Peter B. Collins podcast. James Quigley just took out a second annual subscription to support my work. Thank you, James. I really appreciate that. Brian Mazzy has several subscriptions, a monthly and an annual, if I recall correctly. And Arlene Montemarano is a monthly subscriber who does more than she has to. I want to thank each and every one of you. I invite you to become a new subscriber. A couple of people have signed up in the last few days. I find that gratifying. But I need more help here to replace the people who defected because of my strong opinions and my prediction that Donald Trump could win the election this year. So do what you need to do. You go to peterbcollins.com, click menu, you pull it down, click Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and you're good to go in just a couple of minutes. Naomi Klein is a brilliant woman, a Canadian who has been a sharp critic of American economic policy, and she's got a strong editorial op-ed in the New York Times today that I've linked to in the show file for today's podcast. And she makes a number of important points that are critical to me, because during this campaign, because I was critical of Hillary Clinton, mostly women who supported Clinton decided that I must be sexist. And I got mansplained because, and I was very careful never to take shots at Hillary Clinton for being a woman. I don't think of her that way. I disagree deeply with her policies, and I felt she was a deeply flawed candidate whom I couldn't support. But time and again on Facebook, if I'd put something critical up or a podcast that criticized Hillary, I would hear almost immediately from women who determined that I must be sexist. And I find that really insulting, because there is sexism out there. There are people who opposed Hillary because of sexism and misogyny. I don't happen to be one of them, and many Hillary supporters couldn't tell the difference. So a few quotes from Naomi Klein. Voters chose a loose cannon of a man with zero government experience over a calm, collected, supremely qualified woman. The root cause of this injustice, many have suggested, can only be sexism, proof that the glass ceiling protecting the highest reaches of power cannot yet be shattered. The reaction is understandable. It's also wrong and unnecessarily demoralizing. Now, Klein continues, no female or non-white candidate with Trump's lack of experience, angry outbursts, boasts of sexual assault, trail of broken marriages could have gotten elected. That Trump did, while spouting such ugliness about women and minorities, speaks to deep and persistent strains of misogyny and white supremacy in American society. But we can recognize all this, yet still reject the idea that all women who reach as high as Clinton will meet the same fate. Yes, she had a gold-plated resume that more than qualified her to be president, but that overlooks an important fact. Virtually everything about Clinton's biography made her uniquely unsuited to draw blood where Trump was most vulnerable. In short, she landed on many of the right messages, but she was the wrong messenger. And Klein notes the Clinton Foundation and other issues made Clinton's attacks far too easy to turn back at her. And so Klein says that, when people say it's all about sexism, that is the surest way to ensure that the Democratic Party's disastrous 2016 mistakes will be repeated, because they're blaming the wrong cause. That Clinton could be defeated by the likes of Trump remains disgraceful, but Clinton was too flawed a candidate for this disgrace to go down in history as a defeat for her gender. Let's not hand them power that they haven't actually earned, the power to crush the possibility that the right woman may one day become president. Well said, Naomi Klein. We learned yesterday that some smartphones, Android phones, and some burner phones, the kind of cheap disposable phones that people buy when they want to sneak around and do things they don't want other people to know about, well, it turns out that some of these smartphones are wired with a secret feature, a backdoor that sends all of your text messages to China every 72 hours. Security experts recently discovered pre-installed software in some Android phones that monitors where users go, who they talk to, and what they write in text messages. Now, international customers and users of disposable or prepaid phones, are the people most affected by this. A company called CryptoWire discovered the vulnerability and said that the feature that was added, called AddUps, was apparently intended to track users in China for the purpose of serving ads to them. But the code comes pre-installed on phones, the surveillance isn't disclosed to users, and this is an intentionally designed software feature to monitor user behavior. Now, we're told that it was only supposed to be used in China, not intended for American phones, but it is on some of our phones, and this is just another reason why you've got to be careful, and why we know our government is not protecting our privacy rights, because they want to be able to exploit these vulnerabilities just like apparently the Chinese do. And it's not an indication that the Chinese government is receiving these, it's companies in China. Now, smartphones are also being blamed for distracted driving that has seen a spike in the number of highway deaths by about 10%. 17,775 people died in the first 6 months of this year. And the authorities are blaming distracted driving, including people who are posting on Snapchat, who are updating Waze to tell you where the cops are, and that Pokemon Go has also been a distraction to drivers. And last weekend in my neighborhood, I saw a woman driving a convertible, and she was texting and working on her makeup at the same time. And that's not the kind of hands-free usage that the law intends when they tell you that you can only use a phone that, you're not actually touching while you're driving. So I think this is a serious issue, and I have experienced it myself, where I ran a red light while I was talking to somebody on my cell phone while I was driving. And we have to be vigilant about that. Enough said. Interesting study coming from the University of Michigan's National Registry of Exonerations. And what it shows is that because of the heavy pressure to take a plea bargain, because many defendants are overcharged by prosecutors, that people are pressured to take plea deals and plead guilty even when they're innocent. And last year, out of 157 exonerations, these are people who were proven innocent and released from prison, 68 of 157 were cases where the defendant pleaded guilty. Now, this is an indictment of our criminal justice system. It used to be that about 85% of criminal cases went to trial. That number has been reduced to, or increased to, let me get it right. The number of people who go to trial has been reduced, and the rate of plea bargaining has been increased from 85 to almost 95%. And that means that people's rights are being denied, their right to a fair trial, their right to plead innocence, because of the pressures in the court system. I'm really pleased to see this information come out of the National Registry of Exonerations at Ann Arbor. Well, Bob Dylan has finally dropped the message to the Nobel Prize Committee. With regret, he is unable to go to Stockholm to receive his Nobel Prize in Literature that was awarded to him in October. He's been called arrogant and a lout and all this sort of thing, and he has been kind of cryptic. He didn't really publicly acknowledge the award. Then there was a message on his website that was only there for a day, and he told the secretary of the Academy that he had been left speechless by the honor. He also said in an interview that he would absolutely attend the award ceremony if at all possible. But in a personal letter to the Academy, he said he wishes he could receive the prize personally, but other commitments make it unfortunately impossible. And Leonard Cohen, who just passed away the other day, he said, well, to me, giving Bob Dylan the Nobel Prize is like pinning a medal on Mount Everest for being the highest mountain. And in that vein, we have lost another great American musician. Mose Allison is a man I got to meet and interview a couple of times. He was a whimsical guy who wrote really funny songs. I'm going to link to the YouTube version of Your Mind is on Vacation and Your Mouth is Working Overtime. That was the kind of sardonic humor that he put into his songs, and he mixed bebop and jazz tones with blues sounds and was just an incredible talent. And I got to see him perform live a couple of times, and I've got a couple of his vinyl albums in my garage, and I just had a great deal of respect for him. He lived all the way to age 89 and kept performing until recently, and we wish happy trails to Mose Allison. And finally today, it's a bit of a slow news day, and we turn to my buddy, San Francisco stand-up comic and political satirist Will Durst, who is searching for the silver lining in the ascension of Donald Trump.
Hey guys, Will Durst here with a few choice words about a wake-up call that would have roused Beethoven, who is of course both deaf and dead. And I'm speaking of Donald Trump's surprise victory over Hillary Clinton. The blot heard round the world, and liberals are all a-Twitter. San Francisco is trying to work through the 5 stages of grief, but it's going to take a while to get past denial. The streets of Hollywood are flooded with the tears of distraught movie stars. And MSNBC's anchors reacted like they had just been told their children had been burned beyond recognition in a meth lab explosion. Even Rachel Maddow. So many depressed lefties investigated leaving the country that the Canadian immigration website crashed. But we're Americans, famous for making lemonade out of lemons, and are totally overlooking the possible bright sides of Donald J. Trump becoming our 45th president. So here's 9 to bear in mind. The top 9 bright sides of a Donald J. Trump presidency. For the first time ever, teenage boys will collect photos of the First Lady to be viewed under a blanket with a flashlight, one-handed. Congressional Medal of Honor winner Vladimir Putin. Trump supporters once again have other uses for that collection of white sheets gathering dust in the back of the closet. New style in ladies' fashion, the Stepford look. Bill Clinton can finally take that long nap he obviously so desperately needs in Sweden. 4 words. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Sarah Palin. Now everybody can see Russia from her house. Civil War buffs have a new intranational clash to study, where one side has all the guns and the other all the lesbians, so it sort of evens out. Now, orange really is the new black. And finally, no one will ever blame you for developing a drinking problem during the day at your job as a grade school teacher. For the Peter B. Collins Show, I'm Will Durst.
Thanks, Will Durst. Humor is something we desperately need these days. Thanks for listening. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.